So hi, everybody. We are going to talk today about browser privacy. We are going to have a lively panel, and I know a bunch of you have a bunch of questions because several of you have come up to me and told me so. So we're looking forward to this. What we're going to do is each of our presenters is going to go and present for a few minutes. I'm going to kick off the questions, and then we're going to open it up to yours. I would ask that when you ask your questions, please state your name and your affiliation, and please make sure that you're asking our presenters things which are relevant to browser privacy, because it turns out that they are incredibly smart human beings, but they don't actually do everything on the face of the planet. So we're going to start with Eric. Eric is a program manager on the Microsoft Edge team working on networking and privacy features. He's been working on both websites and web browsers since 1999. I think that means we're going to have a party, right? And he has had previous stints on the security teams for both Internet Explorer and Google Chrome.
Good morning, everybody. I'm excited to present first for Microsoft Edge. In some ways, we are the newest browser on stage, and in some ways, we have the longest lineage. So we effectively relaunched Edge back in 2 weeks ago. We relaunched Edge, and so we're going to talk about kind of what's new and what's not new. So first, I want to set a little bit of context about how we think about privacy and investments in general. And so a key thing to understand is Microsoft loves the web. And this is in multiple forms. We've had people who have been working on the web for 20 years and more. And also we've had people building web applications continuously for a very long time. But for people who are skeptics, there's also sort of the other way of looking at it, which is the web is really strategic for Microsoft. And so, we have Windows as an operating system that's been around for a long time, and it's been sort of our primary platform for our browser. But other platforms are really important now, particularly things like mobile platforms. And so the web is in some ways a common framework or a common platform for us to build things atop. And so a lot of our investment in new products is going into web applications and websites. And so it's really important for us that the web is healthy and continues to grow. Now, one of the things I wanted to set as context as well is sort of the fact that, privacy is not a unique concept to computing. People make real-world privacy trade-offs every day. Things like, am I going to use my loyalty card at the supermarket? Am I going to tweet which flight I'm flying out of and when I'm landing, the fact that I'm on vacation? People make these kinds of trade-offs because they see value in sharing things with other people. Now, privacy decisions are also not made in a vacuum. Your decision about how you do privacy, make your privacy decisions kind of depends on who you're talking to, what the context is, what the sensitivity of the information is. And all of these concerns also apply to web-based privacy decisions. Privacy threat models vary. Different people have different needs, different expectations, and different understandings about what's going on from a privacy point of view. So if we're building a browser for 1 billion or more people, how do you deal with that? Well, you've got to deal with the fact that people are going to make different choices. And so you have to give them the ability to make those choices, but make them in an informed way. So how do you do all this? Well, what we did is we talked to a lot of people. And we've been talking user studies, broad user studies, in-person user studies, to understand the scope of the kinds of things that people expect when they're making privacy decisions on the web. And broadly, and this has been true for a long time, there are different threat actors of interest in the privacy space. Local humans, so people that share your computer, share your house, have access to your device. Browser vendors, do I trust the person, the company that made my browser to have my information? And then finally, and perhaps most interestingly for this conversation, websites, both the sites I visit and the things that they embed. So our browser privacy promise, and more generally our privacy goals for Microsoft, are around sort of 4 major things. Protection. So we're going to protect your data, so people can't get access to your data if you're not consenting to give it. Transparency, to allow people to understand what's happening with their information, who has access to it, in order to make an informed decision about how to protect that data. Control, so just telling people, hey, these people have your data is not necessarily useful. You have to give people controls that allow them to control who gets that data. And then finally, respect. So respect for the fact that your data is valuable and giving you options to remove data or send less data if that's appropriate to you, and generally to try and avoid collecting any data that we don't need for the operation of the browser itself. Now, within all of this, there are principles that we have to live with. One of them is that simplicity matters. Giving people a complicated set of controls like these locks here, some people would see this and be excited, but most people would be scared and the wrong things would happen. Compatibility matters. If we provide great privacy, but we're not compatible with the web, people will either choose a different browser or turn off the privacy features. And then finally, defaults matter. The reality is most people do not want to go in depth on their privacy settings. They just want the right things to happen. They want a reasonable expectation of privacy. And so by setting defaults that are in line with that reasonable expectation, we're going to do better. And then the final thing I want to say about that is the ecosystems and unintended consequences. The web doesn't exist in a vacuum. People who are building sites and services have choices for what platforms they target. They can build a mobile application. They can take their content off the open web and put it into a walled garden. And so if we do things in privacy that hurt the open web, we could end up pushing people to less privacy-preserving ecosystems. And so, for instance, EFF had a piece today about how there's a popular Android app that is leaking data out. And it took a long time to figure out where that data was being leaked because the mobile platforms are less transparent than the web platforms. There's no view source, and you can do things like certificate pinning and so forth to prevent analysis or complicate analysis of those applications. And so the web's transparency is one of the key values it provides. And if we drive people in the wrong way, bad things will happen. So one of our big promises with the new Edge is to help users control how they're tracked on the web. But before I get there, one of the things that I wanted to mention is there's recently been a bit of discussion about how there are certain browser vendors that are new to privacy. And I think that's only true if you ignore the history of what's happened in privacy in browsers. So this was the first article I found about browser privacy. July 20th, 2000, we introduced new features in cookie controls in Internet Explorer. And there's been a 20-year history of continued investment in things around privacy, whether it's controlling third-party cookies, whether it's offering local privacy with features like our in-private browsing, whether it's features that protect the user's privacy more generally. Security is, inextricable from privacy. If you don't have a secure platform, you can't offer privacy. If the user downloads malware that leaks all their data out, you haven't done anything for their privacy. And so we've had a continual investment in these solutions over time, but Edge 79, our newest browser, went stable 2 weeks ago, and so I want to talk briefly about what's new there. The first thing is there's a new foundation for Edge. We've re-platformed atop Chromium, an open source platform used by popular browsers, including 2 of them on stage today. And so this is a great thing for us in a number of ways. There's a lot of security benefit to doing this, and that helps with privacy. But also, a more modern code base gives us the ability to innovate faster and build privacy-preserving features. Now, one of the concerns when we replatformed across Chromium is people said, hey, are you going to then be trusting 2 organizations with your data, Microsoft and Google? And I'm not happy with that. And so, if you haven't been paying attention, we've replaced or removed effectively all of the communication out to the existing endpoints. And so, for instance, safe browsing in Chrome, we've replaced with Smart Screen. So we understand where data is going and what it's being used for. We have a privacy dashboard. So if you go Edge Settings Privacy, you can see the privacy features of the browser and set your controls as you like. We have a white paper that goes through effectively every use of client-server communication in the browser to explain how the data, what data it is, how it's used, what controls are available to the user. And so if you have a question of, well, how does that work? What are the privacy implications of that? We have a white paper that is very lengthy and goes in great detail. We have a new feature that we brought over from our legacy browsers around clearing browser data on close. So you can basically configure certain types of data. Every time you close your browser, just wipe it away. And so this is a feature that we brought back from our old version. But the big new feature in Edge 79 is tracking prevention. So tracking prevention is a list-based approach for restricting access to storage and blocking network requests based on classes of known trackers or things that have the ability to track you in a cross-site context. And so this is a bit of an eye chart, but the general idea is that our tracking prevention list is split into different categories like advertising, analytics, crypto mining, fingerprinting, and so forth. And then depending on the category, we will block different things. Now, going back, the modes that we have available are basic, balanced, and strict. Balanced is the default, where the goal is to be as private as possible without impacting site compatibility. But if users don't want any kind of real blocking, they can turn on basic, which will only block crypto miners and fingerprinters. Or if they want effectively block everything, they can turn on strict mode, in which case everything will get blocked. Furthermore, being built on a Chromium base gives us the ability to run browser extensions that were written for Chrome or other browsers that support that platform. And so if you feel that your privacy needs are different than those that are offered to you, there are other extensions, whether it's a VPN or something like Ghostery, that will show you what you have available to you. What's coming next? So we're going to have a feature that's coming to Chromium. We're going to bring it to Edge 81 around stripping refers so that cross-site data is leaked less often. It's about time. 1992, someone said, someone should think about stripping refers, and so we're catching up. And then we're also inheriting from upstream, having cookies default to same site lax, and that's going to be a big lift, and that's coming very soon. So.
So next up, we have Tanvi Vyas, and she's speaking for Mozilla. So she's a principal engineer and the Firefox privacy lead at Mozilla, where she's advocating for a more private web for all users. And in this role, she leads vision and development of privacy features in Firefox to provide protections against online tracking, coupled with good user experience. She's known in particular for leading Firefox Enhanced Tracking Protection and Firefox Containers. And most recently, she took a co-chair position in the new W3C Privacy Community Group, where she'll help develop privacy-focused web standards and APIs.
Hi, I'm here to talk about the state of web privacy today and what Firefox is doing to improve that. As you browse the web, you're constantly being tracked. Your interests, the sites you visit, the articles you read, what you buy. Profiles are created about you and then shared on the back end by companies, governments, attackers to target and manipulate users. The use of this data has gone too far today, and we can't even imagine what this data might be used for in the future. Here are just a few examples of how our user data is being used in nefarious ways to harm society. Democracies are compromised, and elections around the world are being tampered with. Populations are manipulated and micro-targeted. Fake news is delivered to just the right audience at just the right time. Discrimination flourishes, and emotional harm is inflicted on specific individuals when our algorithms go wrong. And perhaps worst of all, sophisticated users who understand the effect of tracking online have a chilling effect on their behaviors and stop from taking action. Let me ask all of you, how many people in this room have stopped themselves from a behavior online because they were afraid they were going to be profiled, watched, or tracked? I certainly have. This is the reality of the situation today, and at Mozilla, we think this is an unacceptable cost for society to pay, as backed by our Mozilla Manifesto. People are choosing between technology and privacy. They can't have both at the same time. And we envision a web where this isn't the case, where people are put first, where users don't have to look over the shoulder, and ubiquitous tracking does not exist. So we've deployed a suite of privacy protections in Firefox to help get us there, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about our journey to get there. A few years back, we started with tracker blocking. We would block trackers from loading in private mode, based off a static list from disconnect. We would let users who were so inclined opt in to block trackers in regular mode as well. But as time passed, we realized that this wasn't good enough. Most users never change their default settings, and most users don't understand the extent of tracking online. We realized we needed to provide a solution that was private by default. So at that point, it would have been easy to just block trackers in regular mode as well. We already had the technology, we just needed to flip a pref. But we didn't want to do that because we didn't want to break the ecosystem of the web. Specifically, we didn't want to block advertisements, because advertisements in themselves are not bad. It is the tracking and targeting technologies that are used to target advertisements that are the problem. So we decided to attack the tracking problem directly. And instead of blocking the advertisements from loading, instead of blocking the trackers, we blocked cookie and storage access for them, so the ad would continue to load. We also blocked fingerprinting scripts. And in this case, we were blocking the load entirely because the scripts were going too far and trying to learn characteristics about your device to track you across the web. And we continue to block trackers in private browsing mode with the option to turn them on in regular mode. We also wrote an extension called Facebook Container that users can install to put Facebook in a walled garden of its own. Because Facebook continues to track you when you leave Facebook. Every like, share, and login button you see, whether you click on it or not, is used to identify you and see what you're doing, and then go back and tell Facebook about it. So in Firefox, we put a wall around Facebook so that what you do outside of Facebook stays outside of Facebook. We also have a Firefox private network feature that allows you to proxy or VPN your traffic to hide your IP address. And finally, we have a feature called Firefox Monitor that alerts you when a breach has occurred and your credentials might be compromised. And everything that we do is underpinned by our anti-tracking policy, which is an accountable and transparent approach that tells the world which type of tracking mechanisms that Firefox does not allow. And if we find that a party attempts to circumvent this policy by getting around our tracking protections, then the policy gives us a right to apply more restrictions on that party. And this actually came up. We discovered that Facebook was trying to circumvent our enhanced tracking protections by using a link parameter and using it across the first site visit so that they were following you using cookies and links from site to site long after you had left Facebook. So we stripped the FBCLID parameter from all referrers in Firefox so that Facebook couldn't track you beyond the first visit. One thing that makes Firefox unique is that we try to maximize both usability and privacy at the same time. So when we deployed our cookie blocking, we had to be very careful not to break legitimate use cases such as login. But at the same time, we didn't want to give blanket cookie access to any site you might want to log in with. So we deployed careful heuristics to see when the user might be trying to log in. When the user showed intent, we allowed cookie access. Otherwise, we did not. We also developed the Storage Access API, where developers can request storage access for cases where they really need it, asking the user and the browser themselves if it's okay with them. And finally, when we don't get things 100% right and the user does encounter breakage, we allow users a per-site override that allows them to be protected 99% of the time and choose to disable protection when the trade-off is worth it to them. We also added a suite of user privacy tools that let users know how many trackers are out there, who's tracking them, what sites have trackers on them. This lets users feel more in control and have a better idea about what's going on the web. In fact, we've blocked 1.6 trillion trackers since we launched Enhanced Tracking Protection, which speaks to the magnitude of the problem. So what's next for Firefox? We've just started. Arguably, we've only scratched the surface here. We're continuing to evolve and enhance our protections. We've dug a pretty deep privacy hole on the internet, and we're slowly trying to get out of it. We prioritize solutions that have the highest user impact first, and we're working with industry and standard bodies to change the landscape of the ecosystem. But we can't do it alone. Browser vendors need to work together to push the web forward. Legislation and regulation needs to step up here and keep these companies accountable for the invasive and compromising mechanisms that they're using. And finally, you can help too, by deploying a culture of privacy within your own organization, by guinea pigging new privacy-preserving technologies to show that you can accomplish your task and keep user data private at the same time. Thank you.
So next up, we have Justin Schuh from Chrome. He's an Eng director on Google Chrome's Trust and Safety and has been a member of the Chrome team for more than a decade.
He's been working on security, privacy, and anti-abuse for 25 years across the public and private sectors, and co-authored The Art of Software Security Assessment.
Grab the wrong mic. Sorry. To make myself a little bit of space here. Okay, so I'm Justin. One of the teams that I'm responsible for in Chrome, and certainly one of the things that takes the most of my attention right now is the team working on Chrome's Privacy Sandbox effort. So my focus is going to be really on that, which is about improving web standards, improving the baseline. It's really not going to be about sort of like the more browser-specific features approach, because our idea is that we really want to essentially make the whole web better and not have browsers going off in different directions. So, there we go. So first I wanted to actually talk about what makes the web so great. Because, on the open web, we do have a lot of room for improvement, but the truth is that, as a platform, it's been great, and we don't want to throw out all those great parts in the process. So right off the bat, the web is built on top of open standards. And this really has been a huge boon to the web, because you have amazing reach, because the web is a platform that can actually be supported everywhere, and largely is. You're right, I had to raise the mic. All right. Second, there's no single entity that controls the web. The web doesn't have gatekeepers, and that absence of gatekeepers means that you really do have like a low barrier to entry. It's easy for someone to take product, services, whatever they want to do on the web. It's the freest space to do that. Finally, ephemerality. Now, this is sort of the killer feature of the web, where sites have the ability to compose content from multiple different sources. Users can seamlessly migrate between, move between sites, etc. It's one of those things that is so great about the web as a platform, and that's only possible because the web really does have the most robust privacy and security architecture of any platform, like when you view it in the abstract. So all of this makes the web unique and have made the web insanely popular. But it's important to also understand the reason why content producers flock to the web. So you first need to appreciate that most of the media that we consume is actually funded by advertising today. And it has been for a very long time. Now, I'm not here to make the argument that advertising is the best or only way to fund these things, but the truth is that print, radio, and then TV, all of these funded primarily through advertising. And the whole rise of digital media has only been, has only followed on to that effort. And the fact is that having this specific model is what has made a wealth and variety of content broadly available to people that otherwise couldn't get it across the world. So now we want to talk about what people are doing with advertising, and specifically what sellers want from advertising. The thing is, you first need to appreciate that sellers want to be able to measure the effectiveness of their advertising, because that's what's really useful. They want to know that advertising is actually working for them, and the web made that dramatically easier. Digital in general, not just the web, made that far easier. The other thing that sellers want is they want to be able to get the advertisement in front of their likely customers. Once again, digital made that a whole lot easier. And this was a fundamental change. Now, the outcome of that fundamental change has been that digital advertising basically took over everything. Like, absent any other factors, if you can do those two things really, really well, then you get to a place where traditional media gets consumed, just like it has by digital advertising. This is also why when you see studies that call out that you would lose like half or more of web revenue by taking away essentially the tools that are used by digital advertising, that's basically what they mean. What they mean is that the money that flocked to the web because of the tools that it provided will now move elsewhere to places that are providing those tools. So that's how to understand that in context. So with that background, it's time to move on to the core points of why we're all here, which is that for all of the good that the web has brought, it's also come at a significant cost. Like right now, there is just too much data being exchanged. It's it's too opaque, it's confusing. It's just not what users expect or want. And to be clear, this isn't a new thing. This sort of data interchange happened before. You just used to do it through things like subscriber lists or through, the phone book. There are various ways that it was done before, but today it's just happening at a scope and scale because of all this connectivity that no one could really predict. So that's why we need to have new solutions for this. But the solutions have to be robust solutions that really do work. They have to be standard solutions that we can support everywhere in keeping with how the web works. Now, there are two major trends that are concerning. The first is that content is currently leaving the web. And this is happening because it's just easier to monetize in apps today. Now, I do not fault I should say walled gardens, because it's not just limited to apps. So I don't fault these other platforms. They have very different threat models. They're taking a very different approach. And it's understandable. They just work differently. The web is unique in that we have hardened the web by fire over the last 30 years of running potentially untrusted content from any arbitrary source. No other platform has been through that, and that's why no other platform can make the same kind of guarantees as the web. The other big thing is the rise of covert tracking. Now, it's important to understand that there are two major drivers for this. One of the big drivers is that as we had the rise of mobile and people increasingly became multi-device users, you had this situation where advertisers wanted to be able to measure things across different devices because a user might start a conversion on one side, conversion being sort of how they determine that an ad worked, start a conversion on one device, and the conversion might just happen or end up completing on another device. So advertisers came up with ways to track identity across multiple devices. And this kind of tracking focuses on things like IP address fingerprinting and carrier metadata tracking. And the other big one is joining identifiable information, or personally identifiable information. So this is a thing like if you've ever been to a site where they say, hey, if you want to review this content, please subscribe to our newsletter. Odds are it's not so much about emailing you that newsletter, it's about getting your email address so that they can connect your data across multiple devices and sites. Now, the other big driver for covert tracking was to bypass the anti-tracking mechanisms that are starting to appear. So this is a different situation where browsers, as we're discussing today, have been adding new mechanisms, either list-based or heuristic-based, that are designed to mitigate the kind of tracking that we see occurring. They block resource loads or they block cookies, et cetera. The thing is that those, for the most part, are bypassable by the mechanisms that I already mentioned. But in addition to the mechanisms that I just mentioned, you also have a whole bunch of other tricks that can be used to track and bypass these mechanisms. Things like CNAME redirection, client-side fingerprinting, hostname rotation, and the heuristic-based mechanisms can impose other kinds of issues. If your heuristic is state-based and it can be used as a state channel across different sites, it can actually leak information and end up introducing worse problems than what you were trying to prevent. Now, actually, I should go back one, because I want to be clear. We actually do use a lot of state-based we do use a lot of lists and heuristics in Chrome. They're not a bad thing. But you do have to be really careful, and you do have to think about the ecosystem impacts of using these things. Now I'm actually going to get to solutions. So I want to start by saying something shocking, and I'm going to try to say it fast. Broadly speaking, advertisers don't actually need your data. All that they really want is to monetize efficiently. The publishers that rely on them, the content producers that rely on them, they just want to be able to measure, track conversions, et cetera. So what we're proposing here is that we can just give them the tools to do that without actually building profiles on you or tracking you. The approach that we're proposing is called the Chrome Privacy Sandbox, and it has four main prongs to it. The first is to remove the tracking surface. This is just basically take away the easy tools that trackers are using. You may have heard that we're already phasing out third-party cookies. We've started that with the same site by default rollout that's happening now. Our goal is to remove them entirely over the next 3 years and the other state mechanisms that are attached to them. There's also other things like user agent simplification and various other things like our privacy budget, so that we can still allow site developers to do interesting things, but not be stuck within a draconian privacy or within draconian API restrictions. The next thing is audit and attestation. Now, this is for cases where we simply cannot rely on technical measures to provide any reasonable guarantee. So we propose willful IP blindness, which is a way that we can rely on audit and attestation to protect against network tracking. I'm gonna fast forward really quickly now. Next one is privacy preserving APIs. This is meet the use cases that the developers need. We're talking about advertising, addressing that through things like federated learning and other privacy-preserving techniques, but we're also talking about things like login and various other needs the web has today, like anti-abuse. Oh, and anti-abuse is the last one. This is more the broader case of anti-abuse. This is the case of, even with all of the new APIs, we do need to have a way to catch the things that fall through the cracks and prevent sort of the kinds of workarounds and all of that we see today.
Thanks, Justin. Okay, and our last presentation is going to be from Yan Zhu. Yan is Brave's CISO and has been doing security engineering there for the last 4 years. And in the past, she's worked on privacy-enhancing browser extensions at the Electronic Frontier Foundation and served on the W3C Technical Architecture Group.
Hello, thank you. I'm going to try to go fast because I know you guys have a lot of questions and we want to have time to address them. So Brave is the new kid on the block, if we don't count Edge as a completely new browser, I suppose. We started about 4 years ago, and something that people ask is, given that we have all these other great browsers, why yet another one? So the main goal of Brave is we want to repair the privacy problems in the existing ad ecosystem in a way that no other browser has really tried, while giving publishers a revenue stream. So the default in Brave is, and has always been, to block the privacy invasive ads and trackers. I won't get too much into the payment side of things because that's kind of beyond the scope of this talk. But basically, we have options to send micropayments to publishers and also an option to see privacy-preserving ads. So technically, we are a Chromium fork on desktop and Android and a Firefox fork on iOS. So building upon these people's work. As you know, websites are mostly funded by ads. A thing that some people don't realize is when you make a request to a website and the website is showing you advertisements, there's actually many other parties behind the scenes, such as supply-side platforms, ad exchanges, demand-side platforms. So you're not just making one request to get an ad. Behind the scenes, there can be hundreds or sometimes even thousands of bid requests. And these requests can leak data that people find concerning. For instance, gender, year of birth, IP address, and sometimes even geolocation. And as a result of this, and also because users see negative performance impacts and sometimes they think ads are ugly, it's no surprise that ad blocking has been going up pretty steadily in the last decade or so, especially on mobile, which is the orange line. So in Brave, I want to highlight one of our primary interfaces for privacy protection, which is called Shields. So there are these global settings for Shields. These apply to all sites by default. The default is blocking ads and trackers, blocking all third-party cookies, with a few exceptions that we had to make for web compatibility, and blocking third-party fingerprinting, and HTTPS everywhere. And these are all overridable on individual sites as an interface called Shields, and keep in mind these are per site settings. So ads and tracker blocking are based on the lists from Disconnect and AdBlock Plus EasyList. You might ask, so how is this better than if I just download Chrome and install extensions? One of the benefits is that we're able to do this kind of blocking and filtering in languages like Rust, which are better for performance than doing it in JavaScript in web extensions. Another thing that we have tried is device recognition blocking. Some people also call this fingerprinting blocking. These are attempts that sites make to bypass third-party cookie blocking by recognizing users based on their browser traits. This is a best effort defense because when you start to block web APIs, you run into a high risk of breaking legitimate website functionality. So currently we do the best we can, and we only enable this by default in third-party frames. And these are some of the methods that we block. Another cool thing we do is embed HTTPS everywhere by default. So that was a project by the EFF that it's basically a very long list of sites that are known to support HTTPS, but don't default to them. So if a site like New York Times defaults to HTTP and we know it has a valid TLS certificate, we will automatically upgrade it to HTTPS. Sorry. So script blocking is disabled by default because websites really like to use JavaScript, but JavaScript obviously can also be used for tracking. So off by default, but this is an advanced setting that some people can turn on. So I mentioned earlier that we are mostly based on Chromium. We disable a lot of features similar to Edge, such as the Google Accounts integration, Chrome Sync, obviously, Chrome telemetry, URL navigation suggestions, and some other of these features which have some privacy impact. In the cases like safe browsing where we do use the Google service because we aren't running our own, we try to at least proxy the request to hide the IP. So we proxy through a Brave service. Certain web APIs we disable for privacy, such as the hyperlink ping attribute, battery API, web Bluetooth. And in pretty much all these, or most of these cases, it's an API that has some privacy impact, but on the other hand, it's not supported across every single browser, so the risk of it breaking a website is low because, for instance, Firefox or Safari doesn't support it by default either. Perhaps more interestingly, we restrict cookies and refer for third-party sites. So as I mentioned earlier, third-party cookies are disabled with a few exceptions. We also followed Safari's lead in expiring JavaScript cookies after 7 days and setting a max lifetime of 6 months for HTTP cookies. For refer, Eric mentioned that Edge is going to be spoofing or stripping third-party ones. We've actually been doing that for about 4 years, I think. On third-party sub-resource requests, we spoof them. So instead of showing the true refer, we just set it to the origin of the third party being requested. And for third-party navigations, it's stripped entirely. This is good for privacy, but also doesn't have that much web compatibility impact. And I think there's only been a handful of sites where this has broken something. Another thing that we are experimenting with, but isn't yet on by default, is blocking bounce trackers. So this is also following in Safari's lead with intelligent tracking protection. Bounce trackers are these domains that use redirects to track users. So they're never embedded as third parties. Rather, they are used for first-party navigation redirects. So for these domains, which we use a crawler to detect when they're being used as bounce trackers, we just block storage API access, so cookies, local storage, etc. Another thing we do that was implemented really recently is just filter out these known query string trackers. So in addition to the Facebook ID, we filter out GCLD and these other ones. So as I mentioned, this sometimes causes, well, not this exact thing, but these features in general sometimes cause sites to break. So for now, we have just some lists of hard-coded exceptions. So yeah, thank you.
And we get to go to the part that I think you've been waiting for, which is a bunch of discussion amongst our browser folks here. And it's interesting, like we have so many browsers here. Not all of them, but so many of these browsers. And you've all come up here and you've talked about different approaches to user privacy. And I want to know, how do you think collaboration between these browsers helps user privacy and security?
So I'm sure there's a bunch of answers to this, but when I was thinking about this, I think the one thing that comes to mind first is there's that proverb of if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. And I feel like that really applies here because in order for us to make the big changes that we need to really improve the privacy structure of the web, we need collaboration between the browser vendors and, frankly, the people building websites and applications to sort of have agreements about what the shape of the privacy-preserving web ought to be. Because if we don't have that, what we have is the outliers, and outliers can get dismissed. And so we've had cases in the past where we built things, for instance, in Internet Explorer, that were intended to be open standards, but not adopted by other browsers. And as a consequence, people just said, well, don't use IE, use this other browser that doesn't have that thing, because that thing, that's just wrong. That's not the way the web should be. And so if we have consensus and we have consistency and people building together, we can help shape that web that we want to have.
I'm also curious how competition between these browsers helps user privacy and security.
Yeah, I think this is a good one too because, for instance, when Brave sees Safari rolling out this new protection, we think, oh, we should try to at least match that because as a privacy-first, privacy-focused browser with that as one of our main selling points, we kind of have to stay ahead of the curve. So I think competition kind of pushes everyone towards being more private by default. And also, it's good to learn from other browsers, especially for us since we're really small from larger browsers that have a larger user base. Because we assume that if Safari has turned on a certain protection and users have not reported that much breakage, then that's not much risk to us either.
So it's really interesting how you're talking about learning from each other, about going together, about trying new things and getting people on there. I want to differentiate between each of the browsers that are represented here. For each of you, can you tell me what are the biggest differences between your browser, the other browsers represented here, and Safari?
Please rank your neighbor's children by how attractive they are. So it's a great question, and to just riff a little bit on the prior question as well, I think one of the things that's nice is that by having a variety of, shall we call them, credible browsers, there becomes this privacy marketplace where ideas get to get tested and people move based on what they like and don't like. So in terms of kind of where we're at, Microsoft Edge, we have a big install base of our prior browser, but we're competing against browsers. Chrome has the market share to make major changes in the shape of the web that can't be dismissed. And so things that are super ambitious, like the privacy sandbox that will take a long time and a lot of collaboration from the open web, it is great for them to be doing that. And I hear people screaming, oh my gosh, why are they changing things? They just work. And I would argue that that's what responsible platform stewardship looks like, is not allowing sort of the default to just get entrenched and never reconsidered. And so I would say that we are looking a little more tactically at what can we do in the short term about privacy things, so things like tracking prevention, and Firefox has a very similar feature. And so we're kind of in a similar realm there. I would say that one of the things that thus far we've tried to do in Edge is be a little bit more quiet about it. We don't really show off the privacy features at the top level. We don't generally, there's not a lot of indicators saying, hey, we're protecting you in this way or that way, because we think that that's what many of our users want. And then, with Brave, I think Brave is a very interesting position because people that are selecting Brave are doing it because it has that focus on privacy. And they're able to integrate a lot of features that I think are super cool. Their Tor mode in particular provides IP privacy in a way that's not built into other browsers. And so you need extensions for them. And so I think it's super cool to have a browser that's kind of picking a lot of those advanced features and testing them in the market.
I kind of feel like Eric answered for most of us. But no, to double down on what Eric said, in terms of from the Chrome side, I think the biggest thing that we have is we have been able to push forward a lot of major changes that I think are really important to safety on the web. If you don't have the baseline of just even be able to establish a secure connection with a site, like the notion of privacy is kind of silly because any intermediary can look at what you're doing. So, we were very aggressive with mixed content early on. We pushed HTTPS and very much leading on that. And then there are things like we looked at the sort of the big surface areas that were causing problems, and I think I would say that Chrome pushed forward on dealing with plugins. It wasn't that long ago that the web was a mix of proprietary and just very unsafe plugins, and over several years we have gotten to the point where we're removing the last one from the web. So I think it was starting with the really dangerous ones. I'm sure we all remember when you were likely to have an old version of Java that was installed, and it was very easy to have even for a conscientious user, it was very easy for them to just have a drive-by exploit on their machine. And we now live in a world where that doesn't happen anymore. So I would say from the other sides, I actually very much envy the situation that Brave is in, because I do remember when we were a small browser, because Chrome was less than 1% when I joined, and we got to do things that you just can't, like things that I can't do at the scale that we're at, because it would be too destabilizing, which is why our focus is much more on taking the long view, thinking about what things look over several years, and just trying to chart that kind of path forward. It's at our scale, it's just not reasonable to move too fast because it's too destructive. And then with Mozilla, I like the fact that Mozilla just has that level of independence where they're just, so Mozilla has, I've always sort of looked at Mozilla as like the independent voice on the web. They're in it because they believe in it. I think that that's a good thing, and that is such an essential voice to the web as an open platform.
So like Eric said, Brave is smaller and has a more privacy-focused crowd, and that lets us be a lot more experimental and aggressive in what we block or filter by default. And sometimes we take something that Chrome has stated like interest in doing or stated plan for doing in the future, and we just roll out that feature to everyone because we.
I can't do that.
Yeah, exactly. So we don't have the same level of having to get approval for doing these things, I guess. And I think the most fundamental difference is that we have an alternative revenue model for. Rather an alternative to tracking-based advertisement for the web. And so we can kind of reject the entire notion that websites need to be funded by these ads that track you wherever you go, and try something different and build based on that new premise.
So Firefox, Edge, Brave, and Safari all have anti-tracking protections by default. And they all vary a little bit. They all have different trade-offs. I could bore you with all the technical details, but in the end, we're all trying to improve those protections, and as Jan stated, we're learning from each other on how to do that. I think we differ from Chrome in that we're not trying to preserve the existing model. We see, for us, our highest priority is privacy. So when we choose between the existing model and privacy, we'll always lean towards privacy.
Go for it.
All right. So I think our position on this is that, I think the best way to express our position on this is that if at the end of the day, we're just pushing stuff.
Microphone.
Oh, sorry. I'd say our position on this is that at the end of the day, if we're pushing content off of the web, and that's something that we're already seeing happen, that users aren't served. Like the priority of constituencies of the web is absolutely user first, then developer, then implementer. And that is the right set of priorities, but it's not such, I just don't think it's fair to frame it as such a linear line, right? If the web isn't here in 5 years, or it's just marginalized to the point where it's not very useful to users, then I think we've all lost.
Right, so I mean, I personally don't think that the web is dying. I understand that more and more users are using their mobile devices and using mobile apps. And there's various reasons for that. In some cases, maybe it makes sense to use the mobile app instead of the browser. In other cases, maybe it's the website that's pushing the user towards the app. And I know that the privacy landscape in mobile apps is much worse than what we have on in browsers. And browsers have really stepped up in the last few years, and I think mobile operating systems need to do the same thing. And just because a situation is bad in one area doesn't mean that we shouldn't improve it in another.
So why don't we turn to that? Because that is a real elephant in the room here. Like, what is the situation with mobile apps? What is the situation with the ecosystem and the privacy there?
I can start. So Microsoft not presently in the mobile architecture game, and so we get to be a bit of a pure player. We love both iOS and Android. I think this kind of gets back to something I talked about earlier of sort of the unintended consequence of potentially driving people toward building native applications on a mobile operating system or another operating system. And so for us, as a company, strategically, it's super important that the web be competitive. But also, there are some benefits to that. And one of them, as I mentioned, was transparency. The fact that you can view source on the web, the fact that you can run Fiddler or some other network debugger and kind of see what's going on and understand in a way like what the web application is doing that may be more difficult or nearly impossible with a mobile app. And so, for instance, in the example earlier, the mobile app that had the behavior that was a little questionable has been that way for a long time, and people just weren't able to see, weren't able to notice. And so I think, we think that the open web has some serious benefits in terms of its auditability and the ability to look at things. But I will say, and there was the question earlier about how do you compare with Safari, and I think, I can't speak for Safari, but I will say that there is, an undercurrent of all of this, a question about sort of the heart of the web. And so, we talked about some of the benefits of the web around its ephemerality, its openness, and its standards, the fact that you can just go anywhere and look at anything. And so, those are all benefits. And there are people that feel like that and simplicity are the value of the web. And then an alternate view says, effectively, if the web isn't capable and competitive as an application platform, it will ultimately lose. And so that's what goes into things like Project Fugu, about enhancing the capabilities of the web platform in order to be capable of replacing native apps and bring more openness to these things. And so we're pretty much in that camp. We recognize the simplicity of the web as a serious value, but also if the web just kind of stays the way that it is, of a way to view documents and do very simple form filling, we don't think it's going to last. We think it will effectively get less and less of the user's time and less of the attention. And so mobile apps, as Tanvi pointed out, you can make operating systems, because they're behind stores, can actually put requirements in. And so both Android and iOS have previously announced requiring HTTPS for all the mobile apps and data transfers and things like that. But it's hard to move those things, in the same way that it's hard to move the open web. And so ultimately, we think the web is great, and we would love to see everything built on WebTech.
I would like to add just one extra point to that, which is I think when we just talk web versus mobile, we're sort of missing what's going on in the landscape here, which is that you have mobile platforms, yes, but you also have these super apps, things like WeChat and Facebook and that they cross various different platforms underneath them, and they are their own platforms in themselves with entirely different privacy constraints, et cetera, and they are very opaque to us. So I think we have to take a broader look at the entire landscape, and if essentially we are pushing content off of the web, if we're pushing people off of the web and into places where there really is no visibility, I do think that users lose because they are getting materially worse privacy and security.
Yeah, I think that we do have to look at this holistically, but I don't think that means that browsers need to stop their anti-tracking efforts. I think that means we need to get legislation and regulation in place to help in these other situations where we don't have control or we don't have the leverage.
Eric, you have some experience on that one.
So I think Justin's alluding to, one of the things I mentioned earlier was the P3P standard, the platform for privacy preferences. And sort of the anecdote there was, this is a feature that effectively gave us some of the things we're trying to build now, where basically if you were a third-party cookie, you had to declare what you were being used for. And the browser would automatically block your third-party cookie if what you were using it for was not sort of either what the user reasonably would expect or what they had configured. And so when I first came over to the IE team, I'm like, man, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Websites can say whatever they want, and the browser will blindly accept it. And it was explained that at the time, the reason that IE built this feature circa 2000 was there were 26 state attorney general who came to Microsoft and said, if you build this, I will get promoted to governor when I sue companies for violating this. And so basically the enforcement mechanism was the legal system. And Tim Berners-Lee in his book, basically, he flat out said, this won't be enforced technically. We have existing fraud statutes that will enforce it. Well, P3P did end up as a variety of lawsuits, all of which effectively got dismissed. Priorities in the country changed after 2001 in terms of the sorts of things that people were looking to investigate. But at the same time, regulatory systems have kind of rolled around, and we're seeing things, GDPR, CCPA, things like that, where there is now again an interest in doing things around regulation and potentially finding violators and ensuring that people are meeting their privacy promises. And so I think we do need a hybrid approach, though, because there is the risk if you build a technical mechanism which is dependent on the law, it's going to take a long time for that to be enforced. But sometimes we need it. And so one of the things Justin alluded to is this idea of IP blinding, where a web service can say, we're going to discard your IP address and not do anything with it. And that's something you could imagine writing a statute around, which is understandable and unambiguous and potentially enforceable in many of the jurisdictions that people have to operate. And so I think we do need both.
If anybody is going to have questions, get your questions queued up, start lining up at the mic. So I'm going to ask another question here. Since we're talking about policy and law already, how can policy and law people help improve user privacy on the web?
Yeah, so I stated some of this before. Legislation and regulation actually have a leg up when it comes to privacy over security, because the attackers in that context are law-abiding companies, not underground hackers. So I think that they can have real effect here, and we really need a combination of policy and technology to improve privacy on the web. And it's not my area of expertise, but Mozilla does have a team that is engaging globally on data protection law.
So my take is that I think they're I would point to things as like the FDA or other regulatory bodies where they create legislation that essentially empowers a regulatory body of experts and does things. I think those sorts of things can work out well, and I do think we need those sorts of things for privacy. What concerns me is when we have the opportunity to build stronger technical measures, and we instead, if we instead say, no, this is legislation, if we, and choose to build soft technical measures instead, I want us to build robust technical measures. I want us to have frameworks that we consider to be strong and genuinely enforceable through contract law, and then ideally, regulatory bodies would actually be able to point to those and to use those. But I'm very much worried when, so when we take when I hear something that sounds too much like pushing the problem off to regulators, because I think history has shown that if we are not very active and engaged at using levers at our disposal, the technical means at our disposal, the contractual means at our disposal, then regulators will do things that have very perverse unintended consequences.
Okay, so we're going to move to user questions now, or audience questions now. Okay, before you ask your question, please state your name and affiliation, because I know most of you in line, but I'm not sure everybody does.
I'm surprised the first person.
Hi, Eric Gross, unaffiliated. It's really cool to have all of this.
Eric, you're making the same mistake I am. You got to lean into the mic.
Yeah. It's on. Okay, right on it. Okay. Eric Gross, unaffiliated. It's cool that you have all this competition in browser features. Those are really neat. But here's a feature I would like to have. If all of you could agree to define a bland browser, where byte for byte, the same exact bytes would go to the website when I say open a link in a special mode, that would allow me to open a link without revealing anything, even about which browser I'm using. And that would require some collaborations. You all have to agree on what that bland browser is. But the example I would use is, somebody mentioned, do you use a loyalty card at the grocery store? And not only do I not use a loyalty card, I don't even use a credit card, I use cash, because that really makes me look exactly like all the other people using cash. Now, unfortunately, the clerk says, oh yeah, you're the one person here who uses cash. So I don't say it's a silver bullet, but that's something that would be a really nice feature to have, especially if it's really fast. It's like, some kind of a keyboard shortcut, so I can say, open this link without revealing anything. It just makes me look completely like everyone else.
Okay, you have filed a feature request. Does anybody on the panel want to say anything about this feature request?
I think we all have opinions on it. I think the general idea is a good one, right? Users don't want to have to think; they just want the right thing to happen. And so the immediate response to that is, okay, well, you're sending a request over TCP/IP. You have an IP address. I know where it's coming from. And so we start getting into features like, okay, well, how do you do that anonymization of the original location? You get into the fact that you're going to then entrench the capabilities of the browser and say that as browsers get new features, they can't be used until they're in all rendering platforms. And in some respects, that's desirable. That's kind of the idea of commoditizing and standardizing on the web platform. But at the same time, I think you end up constraining a lot of the innovation. And you may end up in cases where sites just don't work or don't have the capabilities you want. And so it is certainly a trade-off. That being said, there is currently one proposal around user agent sniffing, where we are a Chromium-based browser, but we have a token that reveals ourselves to be Edge. And we have already seen certain websites that will serve us different markup than Chrome. Perhaps we're not supported in your browser, please use Chrome. And we kind of say, but we
That's the downside of being a small browser.
We are effectively Chromium. And so, I think there are places where we will strive to be byte for byte identical. And as I understand it, Brave spoofs the Chrome user agent string.
I think we do for now, but in the future, we're not going to. And it's also getting more pointless because yes, you can read the user agent from the header. You can also run a lot of JavaScript to figure out what the browsers are because we block so much that we are pretty distinguishable from Chrome.
Yeah. The other piece is, and sometimes this isn't intentional. And so, for instance, when we first were building our beta builds of Edge, the Google guys helpfully added us to their user agent sniffing library so that Google properties would know when a user is visiting with Edge, which is useful for a variety of things. But they also had some sites and services that had the list of browsers they supported, and they didn't update and were also supported in that Edge. And so by doing certain kinds of mimicking or mimicry or freezing of things, you can improve the state of compatibility and potentially privacy.
Okay, and I'm also going to ask the next person to state their question in the form of a question. Sorry, Eric. Nico?
Hi, Nicolas Tisborski, Google. So my question for you, I guess maybe everybody but Jacinth, because I think he had went over that, but the economic model of advertiser, did you really consider their incentive? As long as you are, I think, fairly small in terms of market share, I don't think the advertisers are really going to invest into technology trying to bypass basically the protection you put in place. But after you represent significant market share, what will prevent them from doing additional changes like CNAME hosting, running on same site, having script included as part of the script of the website, just to bypass your protection? At the end, what's the end game? What end game are you trying to get to? And do you proactively investigate with red teams, the consequence of your defenses and how people are going to defeat them?
Sorry, was the question for me?
I think the question is for everybody. You should totally answer it.
Okay.
Okay, Justin, you can answer too.
Yeah, so we know that that we can't protect against every tracking mechanism, which is part of why we have our policy, and we look for circumvention. And when we find circumvention, we can apply additional restrictions. The CNAME aliasing attack is an attack that we need to address in the future. And we are constantly enhancing and working on our protections to try to figure out how to attack these different mechanisms.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, it feels like a cat and mouse game. If your blocking gets better, then people's evasion evolves to also get better. But I think a point that's often missed is that just by blocking really easy tracking targets like third-party cookies, you actually have huge privacy benefits because a lot of websites won't bother to try the more advanced techniques.
But I think the argument there was at smaller scale, I think that's totally fair. At larger scale, that just does not work anymore. I mean, that has been our experience with things that are not a robust, firm boundary, that the cat and mouse game at scale is unwinnable.
I mean, we're in the same place with security, right? Like we constantly are trying. There's constantly new security attacks, and we're never done. We always have a job when it comes to security. And with privacy, it's the same thing. We're just starting this now.
Okay, I actually very much disagree with that one, just because with security, our focus, I'm actually really impressed at what all of us have done on security over the last decade or so, where we have built robust boundaries, things that are enforceable. Is it perfect? No, but we have built like layers of defense in depth, and that's what I want us to do for privacy, because I look at what the web was like 10, 15 years ago, and like it was literally just way too easy to get owned. Whereas today, we're in such a better place, and it's because we all work together and put in big investments into that, and that's what I want us to do for privacy.
And I think that's where that's the direction that we're headed.
Hopeful.
I think the other thing that I would mention that's kind of a subtext of that question is, like, effectively, if you're pushing billions of dollars around, people will react. And so what do you do? And so one of the things that's nice about this sort of marketplace of ideas in browsers right now is that there are a variety of ideas, some of them very old and previously unsuccessful, but maybe things have changed. And so, as I understand it, Mozilla has been looking at some alternate funding models. There's things like COIL and things like that, where there's potential other ways of supporting websites. And Brave has the basic attention token idea and things like that. Then Microsoft, we haven't announced anything, but we're also watching what other people are doing, and we have some ideas of our own on that front. And so I think, an alternate way of stating it, Justin kept saying, I can't do that, I can't do that. And, the reality is that you can't do it because you would get sued, you would never succeed in doing it, people would abandon your platform at high rates and things like that. And so as you become a major browser, there is that sort of requirement that you be a little bit more conservative. But also, I'm sure that if there's another mechanism that takes off and is doing great, we're going to see it spread to the other browsers. It's just in the alternate monetization mechanisms thus far, they've all effectively failed in favor of advertising. And so if that's to change, it's going to be something that is new, and it's going to be based on, the new reality of the world.
Thanks.
We have seen contextual advertisement, examples of contextual advertising succeed where there haven't been revenue impact. There's a German company called Cobbler. The New York Times changed all their European ads to be contextual after GDPR, and there's a few more.
I would say that some of the arguments there are not, like, I've seen the arguments, I haven't actually seen the evidence backing that up. And when you actually meet with the people literally on the ad tech side of like the New York Times, they paint a very different picture.
I think that contextual advertising has a lot of room to grow and evolve.
Okay, on the left.
Hi, Michael New from DigitalOcean, Associate General Counsel there. So first I want to say, this is more of a question directed to Jan, although I'm sure others will have opinions about this as well. Myself and a number of my friends, we are big fans of the Brave browser, and our company actually advertises on Brave. And so my question is, there was an era, I guess now it seems like ancient history, where Microsoft was embroiled in this battle where everyone thought it was crazy, this idea that browsers were going to be the next operating system, and now we don't use the words operating system very often anymore. And I think my opinion is that we haven't really fully left that era, although now we're talking about mobile environments as being perhaps more important now. So my question for Brave in particular, one of the things that I think makes Brave great is that it is a fork of Chromium, or at least the version I use. And so does Brave have any concerns, or should there be any concerns about anti-competitive activity in the browser ecosystem in this day and age?
Oh, sorry, what do you mean by anti-competitive activity?
So, for example, like Brave, one of the great things about Brave that if you're transitioning from using Chrome is that you're still able to use a number of the features that the Chrome ecosystem offers. But that doesn't necessarily have to always be the case, right? And I'm curious if Brave kind of has a long-term vision for either kind of being parallel to or deviating from that based on the relationship with the other browsers.
Yeah, at least for now, Chromium was just the easiest platform for us to build off of, so I don't think we have any plans to transition off of it. We actually, in the last 2 years, transitioned from Electron, which was this not at all designed for building browsers platform, to Chromium, which is a browser, and that's resulted in a lot of improvements.
one other thing I would say is, as a Chromium fork, you could imagine there was a great deal of concern from Microsoft about throwing away 25 years worth of code and replatforming on an open source project where 90% or something like that of the contributions came from one of our largest competitors. And I will say that, there are places where it makes sense to distinguish Chromium from Google. And, one of the points that I had brought up when this conversation originally came up about replatforming is a great number of the people who work on Chromium are effectively artisans or digital craftsmen who build it because they think it's the right thing to build. And Google happens to be their patron. And one of the points that I made was that if Google took steps to reduce the openness of Chromium or otherwise interfere with the stated goals of the project, they would end up losing the people that were really making that project successful. And so I think it's certainly good to have an eye on sort of the underlying politics about all of this, but also I think it's important to draw that distinction.
Next on the right.
Rick Farrow, Unaffiliated. I would love to see the web take a different direction, meaning that instead of being funded by advertising, which I don't trust and I don't like, I find distracting, that we'd be able to make micropayments. Right now, I know Brave does this to an extent, but they still show advertisements. The owner of a website gets fractions of a set usually for a view. You have to click through before now it becomes a penny or two. So I'd love to be able to make micropayments too, and if you have plans to support this in the future, I think that content developers would actually make more money getting pennies than they do getting web views.
I mean, I guess that's easiest for me to answer because we already do support that. And I think a problem with that is at scale, it's hard to get people like you. Well, obviously like you and me and like people like us would happily contribute our own money to websites. But for a lot of other users, it's hard to get them to do that because they're used to the web being free. And if there's something that's free and suddenly it costs money, that's like very strange to them, especially if the payment is optional. So yeah, that's a challenge, but micropayments is something we offer.
Just look at ad blockers. It's getting to be a bigger percentage. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I would absolutely love to see micropayments succeed. I know there have been a bunch of efforts at Google and various other companies to do it. It turns out that the payment industry itself is really, really complicated, and there are players in there that expect a fairly large cut. And so long as that exists, I don't really understand. I don't know if there's a path forward for micropayments. But I agree. I think that if we could pull that off, it would definitely replace a large portion of what people rely on for advertising.
Thanks.
On the left.
All right. My username is Gabriel DeWitt. I'm affiliated with the advertising industry. Please don't throw things at me. I'm the vice president of product at Index Exchange, global ad exchange. And my question is, and first, thank you all for an elucidating conversation. How can the ad industry work with you guys so that we avoid sort of the fallouts like with GDPR 1 and even what's happening somewhat with CCPA? In other words, changes happen very quickly. We feel sort of out of the loop. We also care about users' privacy, despite, I think, a lot of opinions. But we also have to, support the industry of making money work and paying publishers. So how can we collaborate together? Thank you.
Okay, I guess I can take this one because, I assume that's what everyone's expecting. So I think one of the best forums right now is the WC Web Advertising Business Group. That's the only standards-based forum that exists today. And there's been some very good work going on there. I would like to see all the browsers represented there, and we're not quite there yet, to be honest. I know that the W3C more broadly would like more partnerships with industry where essentially the industries that are impacted by the web are represented. And I do think that's very important. I know personally obviously because of the industry that we're in, we spend a lot of time talking to all comers. And I think that's important for browsers. We have to think of everyone that are relying on the web as a platform.
So we can take one last question as long as everybody is short about it.
Okay, so my question is, Is there anything we can do to stop like an anti-privacy browser from entering the space? Kind of because we have a lot of governments and say other things that aren't really too enthralled about privacy.
So that's a super interesting question.
I think everybody's competition lawyers just had some kind of heart attack.
Right. I'm going to answer a different question instead, which is, we've seen certain cases where, for instance, the government of a country decides that everyone must install their root CA so they can man in the middle all their network traffic. And so how do you deal with that as an industry? And the answer is yes, for competition reasons, largely we don't talk directly to the other browsers and come up with a course of action. We independently look at what we're going to do, what we've previously said we're going to do, and then try and drive it. Now, it's desirable for all of us to have a certain level of consistency in that answer, because if, for instance, 2 out of the 4 browsers, 2 out of the 5 browsers implement a protection and the other ones don't, then the government just says, hey, the official browser of our country is this other thing, and we'll put you in jail if you don't use that browser. And so when nation states come to play, things get a lot more complicated. You end up with executives of your company in jail because you're not playing along with the party line. And so I would say that nation state attackers are a very different thing that requires a different set of interventions, whether it's going to the US government and saying, hey, did you guys see this? Because we're worried about this in terms of democracy. But I think privacy, a lot of the commercial things are things that we're sort of better set up to handle, even though they're not simple problems either.
Okay, so we are sadly over time, and I know this has been a fascinating conversation. Probably more of you have questions. If you come up here, hopefully some of our panelists will hang around afterwards. But in the meantime, let's all thank them.